Hello, everyone. It's 12:30 here in the UK, so British raised people would say good afternoon. As an Italian, to me, it's always easier to say good morning at this time of the day. I know that it's a different time of the day for many of you, so good day, whatever time it is. This is day 3 of the International Journal of Press Politics annual conference. I am Christian Vaccari, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the journal. If you're here by now, I think you should know what the rules are. And so without further ado, it is my great pleasure to hand over to Joyce Nip from the University of Sydney, who will be chairing our first panel today, which is titled Media Policy Between Old and New Challenges. Joyce, thank you very much for chairing, and over to you.
Thank you, Christian. I'm going to keep the time for the presentation and discussion. I think everybody knows that you are expected to speak for 12 minutes only. And when you come to the 12-minute mark, I'll interrupt you. And if you continue, I'll interrupt you again at the 15-minute mark. So you have a total of 25 minutes. So the more you speak, the less discussion time there will be. Without further ado, I'll call on the first speaker, Nahema Marchal. I hope I pronounced your name. This is a paper co-authored with several of your colleagues from the University of Zurich. I don't think I would try to pronounce the names. I'm sure I'll get them wrong. The title of the paper is Content Moderation in the Digital Democracy. What's the problem? Nahema, off to you.
Thank you, Joyce, and thank you, Christian. I'm going to try to keep the time today. If I could just be allowed to share my screen. Thank you so much for joining this session. My name is Nahema. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Zurich. And today I'm going to present on a paper that's being developed with a number of other colleagues on the Prodigy project, which stands for Problem Definition in the Digital Democracy. So I'm going to first start by providing a little bit of context on the motivation for this paper. And then I'll review our methodology and research design before outlining our preliminary findings. So our overall goal in this project is to better understand the politics of content moderation, and specifically to try and map out how different types of actors are framing this issue on social media. Now, content moderation itself, we define in the paper as the practice by social media platforms to screen the kind of content that is posted by users on their sites to determine whether it breaches either the platform rules or constitutes some form of illegal content, such as terrorist posts or child abuse imagery, and should therefore be removed, as well as all the institutional mechanisms that are put in place by these platforms to adjudicate and enforce these rules. You can think of the Facebook Oversight Board, for example. And as I think is quite clear from this little collage of recent headlines I've put together, social media content moderation has really emerged in recent years as a key political and regulatory issue that's being tackled in a number of different and quite conflicting ways at times. So on the one hand, just to take an example from the slide, you have some advocacy groups and governments that have been actually demanding of platforms that they intervene even more than they currently do in order to protect users from malicious or potentially harmful forms of speech, such as hate speech or misinformation, with lots of legislation being passed or currently being drafted in Europe. And there's been ongoing discussions in the US about reforming Section 230, which currently gives platform immunity from being liable for the content that users post on their sites. On the other hand, you've had politicians in governments that have been going in almost the opposite direction, as very recently the president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, and who are taking issue with moderation itself and taking active steps to try and prevent platform from removing any type of content. So it's very clear that content moderation is a complex issue around which there's no clear consensus around the best course of action, in part also because it's tied with so many larger questions around legitimacy, accountability, and fundamental rights. For example, who really should have the power to decide what is appropriate content, especially when that content is not illegal per se, what the rules should be, and whether this requires government oversight at all. Now, many scholars in recent years have turned their attention to this question of platform governance and scrutinized the process of moderation itself. But currently, there are few studies that are trying to map and understand how this issue is being framed by different actors and how these frames have evolved over time. Now, why does this matter? Part of our argument in this paper is, and one that is rooted in the policy development literature, is that novel policy issues, and particularly the ones that pertain to emerging technologies, do not arrive on the political agenda overnight, but instead, this is the result of a process that is generally quite contentious and that first involve framing an issue in specific terms, and then putting arguments forward as to why policymakers should actually pay attention to it and prioritize it, in policy. That process itself can be done by many actors, such as the media, policymakers, or political parties themselves. But recent research really shows, ironically, that social media has expanded the range of actors who can participate in that process, shape public discourse around issues, and even bypass traditional party actors in driving issues on the policy agenda. So for that reason, we think there's value in trying to understand and examine how policy discourse around these emerging issues has evolved on social media, and how these competing policy frames become more or less salient if we want to better understand how these views spread to the political agenda, which is our end goal with this project. Now, in terms of our data collection, so we collected tweets that were posted between January 2020 and April 2021, based on a list of keywords that I've linked to here related to content moderation. We filtered those tweets as well using their timestamps, which encodes the time zone in order to further restrict them, and developed a code book and build a classifier to classify and sort through our entire corpus of tweets and make sure that they were actually relevant to what we were looking for. And our final data set consisted in about 600,000 original tweets and 2 million retweets from about 1 million unique users. Now, our preliminary analysis involved 3 main tasks. First, we wanted to identify the community of users who were talking about this issue on Twitter. And for that, we reconstructed the retweet network of Twitter users who posted about content moderation and were either retweeted themselves or retweeted others at least 10 times during our entire data collection period. Okay, in the second step, we wanted to characterize these communities, so find out who were the users talking about it. For that, we deployed a Louvain community detection algorithm, looking at the users' top hashtags, engrams, as well as their bio descriptions. And finally, to identify the core topic of discussion, we deployed a topic model. So now moving on to our findings, as you can see from the figure I've included here, which sums up basically the activity, Twitter activity around content moderation during the data collection period. Content moderation itself really became a salient topic after Twitter first fact-checked President Donald Trump in June 2020. This was after Trump tweeted a false claim in the lead up to the US presidential elections, stating that mailing ballots were being fraudulent. Twitter decided to put a warning label in the post and describe essentially the claims as unsubstantiated, which was unprecedented at the time. There were a couple of other more spikes. In July 2020, Twitter decided to lower the visibility of QAnon-related accounts, and Facebook followed suit in October 2020. But then all of the conversation really spikes in January 2021 in the aftermath of the US Capitol building attack, when Twitter decided to permanently suspend Trump's account after he posted a string of tweets that were deemed dangerous to public order. Now, moving on to the structural analysis. As you can see here from the figure included, we found that the majority of users in our sample were clustered into these two distinct groups, representing the more left-leaning and more right-leaning users in blue and red, respectively, with about 55% of users in the red cluster, and a much smaller cluster of foreign media outlets, which is depicted in green here. And this clearly suggests quite a polarized discourse in which users are basically retweeting each other if they're from the same political orientation, but do not retweet members of the outgroup. Some of the most frequently occurring hashtags in the tweets and bios of the blue cluster were things like BLM, Resist, Big Lie, and Joe Biden. And you can see that some of the prominent commentators in that cluster are famous liberal commentators like Rob Reiner, whereas in the red cluster, the more frequent hashtags and in their tweets and bios were things like big tech, 2A, which refers to the Second Amendment, and ones that were related to the election, such as MAGA or Keep America Great. And the top users were either famous conservative politicians or activists like Rudy Giuliani and Lindsey Graham. And finally, I've included here the results from our preliminary topic model. So you can see in the figure the distribution of topics by community. Overall, we found about 5 topics that best describe the nature of the conversation. Most of the tweets, about 75%, were about the Trump ban, Trump being suspended from Twitter, and about the deplatforming in general, with a couple less tweets about Section 230, censorship, and Twitter. And you can clearly see that there are some differences in the ways in which these communities are focusing and emphasizing these issues. The left-leaning users tended to focus a little bit more on the ban itself, justifying, the Twitter's decision to deplatform, and also the need for Section 230 to be reformed in order to hold politicians accountable for what they were posting on platforms, especially if it could incite violence. Whereas right-leaning users tended to hone in on the power, actually, of big tech companies to adjudicate their speech, and how the ban constituted a potential violation of the Second Amendment. So to summarize quickly our findings, really what we can see from our data at this stage is that the attention to content moderation as an issue really spiked following those decisions from platforms to regulate the activity of prominent political figures like President Trump, as well as prominent groups like QAnon. And the structure of the discourse network reflects this sort of familiar polarization, which is common in American political discourse, with left and right-leaning users focusing on slightly different overlapping aspect of content moderation. And in terms of next steps, so moving forward, we'd like to identify more specific policy frames. And so this might entail paying more attention to any moralizing language or specific terminology that could be marshaled in the discussion of the topic, better distinguish between party versus non-party actors, and ultimately analyze how these different frames vary across these groups over time, and whether they do around these salient events. So I am going to stop here. Thank you so much for listening. And I forgot to mention at the beginning, but many of my colleagues are here, so we welcome your questions or any suggestions that you may have on how we can take this paper forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Nahema. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. Now we have a discussion about the paper. Well, maybe I'll take the privilege of being the chair to ask the first question. Well, you did say that this is an issue about policy regulation of speech, and that is surely not an issue specific to the United States, but the issue that you chose to look at is an issue in the United States. I just wonder whether you have any sense of the percentage of the users in your Twitter data set. How many of them are from the United States, and how many of them are from outside the United States?
Well, thanks, Joyce, for that question. If it's okay, I'll answer that one, and I can pass on to my colleagues. So it's famously tricky to identify the specific location of Twitter users, given that a very small percentage of them actually geocode their tweets. So the workaround that we've gone for here is to actually filter the tweets by time zones, that which encodes, by time stamp, which actually encodes the time zone. So that limits to a certain extent the origin of the tweets to the Americas broadly conceived, but we cannot get an accurate percentage, of users that are physically located in the United States. Having said that, content moderation is also an issue. I think that applies and is relevant to broad spectrum of English-speaking Twitter users. So.
We've got some interesting questions that have come up in the chat. So I'm not, where has my chat gone? Sorry, I'm not seeing it. Okay, it's a very small box. Okay, there's a question from Jason. The previous slide mentioned Trump and the Second Amendment, the rights to bear arms. Is this correct? Is it not the First Amendment?
Okay, thanks, Jason, for this question. So that is correct. And the Second Amendment hashtag, that was one of the top occurring hashtags in the red cluster, meaning that this is one of the things that was most frequently mentioned either in the description of these users' bio or used in their actual tweets, which confirms essentially the prediction from the community detection algorithm that these users were right-leaning or conservative-leaning. You're welcome.
Was gun ownership discussed in these tweets?
So gun ownership was not the thing that was mentioned in the content moderation dataset per se, but in the retweet network, when we characterize actually where the users come from and where they're placed on the political spectrum, we looked at some of the hashtags that were present in their bios, as well as in their tweets. So a substantive discussion of gun ownership. Sorry, but this is one of the hashtags that was present.
Well, in the paper you uploaded to the Dropbox, I noticed that you say that you have chosen to assign the tweets according to the highest probability topic based on the model, instead of according to the proportional probabilities of all the topics. Would you like to elaborate on the rationale of that decision? And how do you think that the result may be different if you take the other approach in assigning the tweets?
Sure. Maybe I can give this one to either Fabrizio or Jonathan or Emma if you want to answer.
Sure, I can take the question. Thank you very much for the question. So basically, the output of the models that we have shown in the paper and in Nahema's presentation is a typical output from topic models, which identify the share or estimate the share of each text, in our case tweets, which can be assigned to one of the given topics, and based on those estimates, we can identify the top words which are associated with each topic. So this is roughly what the topic model approach that we used does. So I'm not sure what's exactly the alternative that you were suggesting, but that's what our models do.
Well, I'm not a technical person, but my understanding when I read the paper is you assign the tweets based on the one topic that takes the biggest proportion of that tweet, rather than assign that single tweet to several topics based on the proportion of each of these topics. Am I correct?
So it's topic models are mixed membership models, which means that the assumption is that each text is made of multiple topics in different percentages, right? And so depending on the distribution of the topics, it might be easier or less easy to categorize tweets into specific topics, but that's not what we're interested in. So we're not interested in classifying each single tweet. Instead, we want to pick up the ways in which different actors talk about content moderation, as well as variation over time, which is not something that we have done so far, but this would be part of the next step to compare how the ways in which content moderation has been framed by different actors has changed, especially before and after key events such as January 6th.
There's a question here. Do you think the kind of argument made by leaders such as Bolsonaro can gain broadly support among other users besides the it's not working very well, the chat. Okay, it has gone. Besides the scroll up and down.
Considering that besides their supporters, considering they are often presented as a resistance to censorship by platforms, in some could different arguments make a difference in the partisan divide you found? Nahema? I'm happy to take the question, but you're...
Sure, I can offer my quick opinion, but feel free to chime in. I think this is partly what we're trying to understand, right? So I think one of the interesting questions here is whether there's differences in how traditional party actors and interested citizens or civil society groups, advocacy groups actually talk about these issues, and could these different types of arguments actually have differing impacts on how these issues are discussed or brought to the policy agenda. So it's still an open question, I think for us. But.
Right, there is a request for you to elaborate and give more details about the methodology. What tools were used to collect the tweets and analyze them?
Yeah, I can actually answer that one and then the next one in one go, maybe. So we detail all of this in the paper, but we use the academic Twitter API to collect the tweets. And then Sylvia's question about how we identified the political leanings of the actors in a network visualization. So again, all the steps are outlined in the paper, but we use a Louvain community detection algorithm. And the communities were characterized by looking at a combination of the most influential users in the retweet network, as well as the descriptions in the user bios, engrams, and top hashtags. I'm not the expert on the network part, and Meysam unfortunately could not join us today. It's one of our co-authors who actually implemented this part of the analysis, but this is detailed very specifically in the paper, that the users were the ones that were most central in terms of their connection to other users in the network.
Thank you very much, Nahema, for the presentation and interesting discussion. Well, there are still more questions in the chat, as you can see, so we could continue the discussion there while we hear the second paper. The second presentation is Funding Democracy, Public Media and Democratic Health in 33 Countries, presented by Timothy Neff. The paper is co-authored with Victor Pickard, both of them from the University of Pennsylvania. Timothy, are you with us?
Yes, thank you so much, Joyce. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and get this going here. Issue here.
So while the presenter presents, you are encouraged to type your questions in the chat.
Okay. So I should be able to share this. Apologize for that little glitch. I have a new computer and it wasn't quite. Okay, can people see that?
Yes, not
okay.
Full screen yet.
Is that okay?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So my name is Tim Neff. I'm a postdoc at Media Inequality and Change Center at UPenn Annenberg, and this is a co-authored paper with Victor Pickard called Funding Democracy, Public Media and Democratic Health in 33 Countries. And what we're doing essentially is putting markers of the health of public media systems in relationship to the health of democracies. And we're doing that by looking at funding levels, audience shares, regulatory structures that produce arm's length relationships to government. And we are using the Economists' rankings of democracies around the world to see if there are correlations here, see specific ways that public media can support healthy democracy. So to start with the big takeaways here, healthy public media and democracies exist in a virtuous circle relationship. We do not argue that there is a direct causal relationship here, but there is a reciprocal relationship. Okay. Public media are highly correlated with high levels of political engagement. This aligns with a lot of previous research showing that one of these specific strong signals that comes out of the research here is the level in which strong public media systems encourage political participation, are associated with higher levels of political knowledge, and that's something that we see in our research as well. We also find specifically that multi-year funding, secure streams of multi-year funding, and various regulatory structures, which I will get into in a moment, can and do in fact maintain independence from governments. And we do a cluster analysis and we find that there are 5 dominant public media system types around the globe. So these are the countries that are included in our analysis. There are 33 of them. We're trying to expand this type of research beyond North America and Western Europe, which dominates this type of research. So we're including countries in South America, in Africa, Australia, Asia, and I don't want to list off all of the countries here, but there are 33 of them. They're all ranged in the Economist Democracy Index as either full or flawed democracies. So here's the first data set. This is the Economist's 2019 Democracy Indices, and these are 4 of the countries in our study: Norway, South Korea, US, and Colombia. And you can see here how the Economist ranks these countries 1 through 23, 25, 20, 45. There's also an overall score that they use, but this overall score is composed of sub-indices or subcategories. So they look at whether the electoral process, free and fair elections, functioning of government, free of corruption, undue influence, political participation, the level of public participation in democratic processes, political culture, the level of public support for democracy, and respect for civil liberties. So this allows us to start to look at specific markers of public media system health in relationship to specific markers of democratic health, essentially. This is the second data set, which is the gist of our data, really, is gathering revenue, audience share, national GDP data, and then multiple markers of strong regulatory structures that help ensure independence of public media systems. So all of these figures are the revenue figures are adjusted by purchase power parity. So we're using international dollars here. You can see that per capita public revenue, as you go from the top ranked to the lower ranked democracies, tends to decline. Norway, 110 per capita, down to 14 cents per capita in Colombia. Audience share also tends to decline. Country GDP it's a complex relationship here, but GDP is an important intervening variable in our research, that because we know that there is an association between how well public media are funded and the level of national economic activity. And then these regulatory structures, just quickly, we're looking at license fees or equivalent taxes that directly link public media funding to publics. We're looking at multi-year funding, whether there's some form of secure funding mechanism over multiple years. We look at charters and legal laws to see whether these public media systems are established as independent institutions, their own entities. We also look at whether the management and supervisory functions of these public media systems are separate, so no political direct involvement in day-to-day operations at the public media system. And finally, we look at pluralistic appointment of leadership, and that involves we don't want to see any single executive power having the ability to say this is a person that's going to sit on the board of supervisors. So that's a nominal definition of pluralistic appointment. So what do we find? We run, first of all, bivariate correlations. And these are correlations for funding per capita, essentially. So there is high correlations with the overall democracy index. Let's try to move this here. I'm having a bit of a tough time seeing it. Okay. And strong correlations with the free and fair electoral processes. Political participation again and again and again arises in our research as strongly correlated with these markers of public media system health. So there seems, again, this is aligning with previous research showing levels of political knowledge and political participation being positively associated with strong public media systems. And political support, political culture. So support for democracy also has a strong association with these other sets of data on public media systems that we're gathering. We find less strong and at times negligible relationships between proportion of public funding out of the entire pot of funding for these public media systems. But that's a complex relationship, and I'm happy to talk more about that in comment in the questions and answers. But we don't find a strong association between specifically public funding. We also find a slightly weaker correlation between audience share. It does seem to matter. Having a large footprint in these media systems does seem to be important, but not as strongly as the overall funding. GDP, again, I said, was an intervening variable here. We do find that it's highly correlated with strength of democracy. But when you get into it and you take a look at what's happening here with GDP, you see that there's some interesting disparities in the level of support for public media systems. This chart is showing the proportion of funding for public media out as a proportion of GDP per capita. So if you're higher on this chart, it means there's a larger disparity between how strong your national economic activity is and how much money is going to your public media system. And we see here Taiwan and US, Colombia, these are countries where there's a vast disparity between the level of GDP and how much money is going into the public media system. Lower, there's a trend line here where most public media systems fit on this trend line. And the higher ranking democracies are at the low end of this trend line, where there's a very small, much smaller gap between GDP and funding of public media. So this is just to show that there are GDP, there are these inequalities among public media systems and disparities that we can find within our data. And that helps us intervene in some policy conversations based on this data. We also run multiple regression analyses using all of our regulatory variables. So again, license fees, multi-year funding, independent institution, pluralistic appointment of leaders, and separation of management and supervisory functions. And we don't think any one of these in isolation is enough to support an arm's length relationship between public media systems and governments. But we do find that our regression model has a strong fit, again, with political participation, is strongly, significantly correlated with strong regulatory structures. But we also find strong fits with the overall democracy index, the functioning of government, and political culture. Next up, finally, what we do is we look at, in Helen and Mancini's research, which we're all familiar with, they look at different national media systems. What we thought about doing here was, we have representatives, countries that represent the three media system types in Helen and Mancini. So, liberal, polarized, pluralist, and democratic corporatist. And we know that public media are different than commercial media. So we wanted to look within each country, these markers of public media system health. We wanted to see if there are specifically public media system types that emerge from this data. And we do find that there are 5 predominant types of public media systems around the world. The first is what we're calling the democratic corporatist model. I'm just drawing that directly from Helen and Mancini. Most of these countries, Norway, Sweden, UK, Iceland, Germany, Denmark, and interestingly enough, Mauritius, fit into this democratic corporatist type. Denmark and Mauritius being slightly outliers on this. This type of public media system is characterized by multi-year funding, large audience shares, and strong regulatory protections. They tend to tick off all the boxes on the regulatory frameworks. And they tend to have the highest on average democracy index. Next is the what we're calling the liberal pluralist media system. And this simply describes the fact that there are countries from the liberal media system and the polarized pluralist system that are mushed together in this type: Canada, New Zealand, Spain, France, Uruguay, and Argentina. These media systems public media systems have slightly moderate levels of less secure funding and weaker regulatory protections. And it's very interesting the point at which they start to kind of break down in the regulatory structures. They tend to have less pluralistic appointments. So in some cases, there are direct appointment of supervisors by political leaders. And in other cases, there is a blurring of the line between supervisory and daily management functions. Those are the kind of the part of the regulatory structures here that tend to be open to some form of political instrumentalization of these systems. Direct funding. This is a broad, this is essentially public media systems with license fees or direct tax or equivalent taxes. And this is a broad funding mechanism that we're finding around the world. And we find within this group that's united by this type of funding mechanism, 2 kind of subgroups that differ in the proportion of public funding out of overall funding. So group 1 here, Ireland, Italy, Cabo Verde, South Korea, and South Africa have less public funding as an overall percentage of their funding. Group 2 has more public funding. But generally speaking, these do tend to have higher audience shares, not multi-year funding, and they're right on the bubble between what the economists would consider a full and a flawed democracy on average. The fourth model is this what we're calling commercial public, and it's a kind of a widely varying model. On average, these public media systems are more reliant on commercial funding, but this is largely an effect of having Chile, Colombia, and the US in this group. Australia, Estonia, Taiwan, Latvia, India have higher proportions of public funding. However, in addition, these tend to have overall lower funding, and they tend to have lower audience shares, and we are in flawed democracy on average territory here. And then finally, there's the state-administered systems. We do have 2 of these in our data set. Botswana and Tunisia. Fundamentally, these are not established as independent institutions, and they have the lowest average democracy index. Okay, and I'm just going to wrap it up with policy implications. First of all, Independence must be enshrined by founding charters and laws. That's the fundamental basis for having some arm's length relationship from government. Public media system leadership must be insulated from politicization, and that's one place where we start to see things break down a little bit in some of these public media systems. Multi-year funding emerges as a key pillar of support in our research. And finally, license fees, although they are found in the democratic corporatist model and they are associated with strong public media systems, they are not on their own sufficient for a healthy public media. They work in combination with other regulatory structures and funding levels to support the health of these public media systems. And I'm going to wrap up there, and thank you. And I very much look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Timothy, for the presentation.
You're welcome.
Well, while we wait for some more questions to come up, maybe I'll ask the first question. Well, I read your paper, Timothy. You reported that there are weak correlations for audience share for most of the EIU's democracy indexes. It seems counterintuitive because people would think that people have to watch public media before the effects could be felt. How do you explain that?
That's a great question, and I think that is I would like to say further research is needed, but I can offer some preliminary thoughts on that. I don't think that our variables are able to get at all aspects of the way that these public media systems interact with other media in these media systems within these national media systems, and so there are, even a public media system that has a relatively smaller audience share does potentially have some intermedia agenda setting function. Perhaps we need more research on that. There are other ways that there are things that we can't really measure with our data, and having a public media system that is strong and independent, even if it does have a relatively smaller footprint in the media system, may have effects beyond that radiate out that we just simply aren't able to measure here. But that's definitely a direction for further research here. Thank you.
Could I also ask, because you use correlation for some of the variables, the funding variables, but then you use regression for the regulatory framework, why is this difference in the choice of the method?
Right, thank you. Again, a really good question. Our approach with running the correlation analyses was we wanted to think about regulatory structures as working together, to not take them in isolation, just to think about how they might work together to support public media systems. So when it came to the regulatory structures, we really wanted to combine them in a way. And within that, you can also see the significance of those individual regulatory structures. So again, multi-year funding is one thing in our multiple regression analysis, comes out again and again and again as a strong signal that is associated with the strength of these democracies. So that was essentially it. We just kind of, it felt like it was a little bit inadequate to take a dichotomous variable like license fees, yes or no, and see how the degree to which that correlated. But it does come out in the multiple regression analysis as well. Thank you.
There's a question from Isabella asking, did you also include the level of private media concentration in your analysis? Because in some countries, few private companies dominate the market, such as in Brazil.
Right. Yeah. Excellent question. Thank you. We didn't look at levels of media concentration in our analysis, and that would be a fascinating thing to look at. I mean, we were looking at. I guess the way to think about this is we're looking at one form of ownership here, public media and private media. It's a different sort of animal in very many ways. We do find in our audience share data does to some extent get at levels of concentration, because you can see in the data where you have a public media system that really is dominant, like the BBC or NHK in Norway. But also I'm looking forward to the next paper on Taiwan as well, because Taiwan is a really interesting example here. They have the public media system has a very small footprint, and it's a very very diverse media system. I mean, so that's that low footprint of the public media system in Taiwan is to some extent an effect of a very liberalized media system. But I think that this is a great question. I don't have a good answer to it, and I would love to get more thoughts on the way to bring media concentration more strongly into this analysis. So thank you.
Another question that also touches on private media is, when you define public media, do you exclude private media in your discussion? Because there are some public service requirements on private media as well.
Right, thank you. Great, yeah, we thought about that as well. And we do, it's very common in the literature to find these media systems referred to as public service media systems, but it is the case, you're right, as you say, it is the case that private media often in these media systems have very strong mandates to provide some sort of public service, or they, certainly private media and commercial media do have public service capacities, and they do fill that role in various ways. I guess that the way we were thinking about public media here is we wanted to know the extent to which, journalism facing a crisis around the globe in various ways, the commercial model being very much under pressure. We wanted to start to think about the ways more public sources of funding could start to fill some of those gaps. And so that's really like the first step here, is to think specifically about public funding and the ways, the specific mechanisms of that funding, the specific regulatory structures that can perhaps down the road start to pick up some of the slack. As we're seeing in initiatives such as in the UK and in New Zealand, we do have these efforts to try to bring public media into these voids that are being produced by the retreat of commercial media. So that was really why we focused in on the public media and really focused in on this sort of like, the government supported or public supported solution. I don't know if that answers your question. Go ahead.
Well, there's quite a lot of interest about private media. How about the distinction usually made between public service media and state or party media? Well, but I noticed that in your paper, you actually say you favor the democratic countries. So therefore, the state or party media is excluded from your definition of public media, I believe.
Right, thank you. Again, great question. That was very, very important for our method here. So we tried to, our selection process involved taking, we wanted to select countries from all of the Economists' 7 regions. We wanted to really expand this around the globe to bring as wide a scope as we can. But one of the ways, we did not want to include state-administered broadcasters, generally speaking. So we favored the higher ranked media systems in each of those 7 geographic regions. That said, that still brought in public media systems such as Botswana and Tunisia, which are state administered. And actually, in retrospect, I'm kind of glad that happened, because they really helped fill out this typology that we're coming up with for public media systems. Our cluster analysis, Tunisia and Botswana are clear outliers. And when you run this cluster analysis, they only kind of join the group at the very last stage. So it really enabled us ultimately having them brought in, which was just purely by using the methodology. They just kind of got brought into the analysis. It now enabled us to really kind of have a full spectrum, I think, here of public media systems. Not to say that there might not be other typologies out there that we should look at, and not to say that we shouldn't further develop these in ways. But I think it was good that we ended up having a couple state administered broadcasters in here. And that's one of the things I would say about this proportion of public funding having a bit of a weak or negligible relationship with specifically public funding. To some extent, that is a bit of an artifact of having these state administered systems in here, because they are heavily publicly funded. I mean, they're essentially government agencies, right? So that does tend to kind of affect the correlations. And when we remove them, we start to see that proportion of public funding variable, the correlation rise a bit. But that's definitely a route of further research. Thank you.
I think we can have the last question on this paper. Okay. That is the inclusion of channel 4 that is described as a hybrid, because it changes the percentage of public and license fee funding. So
yes, so we
public and private.
Right, thank you. Yes, that's a great point. There are hybrid public, private, commercial, non-commercial models in here. And for sure, the US system itself entirely is a hybrid commercial public model. We wanted to include all broadcasters that were established by state charter, essentially. that were established as entity, like in UK, the Channel 4 is an entity of the Crown. I don't know if that's actually the word. I'd have to go back into the mandate for that, but it is essentially a state-owned or a government-owned broadcaster that is getting commercial funding, right? So we included across our analysis broadcasters like that. TV New Zealand is another example of that. That is, it's not that unusual, but we wanted to try to include everything that was under the umbrella of a government established broadcaster, essentially.
Well, really the last question, because this is interesting. Okay. It talks about the Eastern European countries, talking about why did you only pick 4 from them? Because they think, well, this question says maybe the selection of the countries may affect your results.
Right. Thank you. There are more, so many more countries. We'd like to include all countries if we could. I mean, this is again kind of just an artifact of the methodology. We took a fairly neutral, like we're just going to take the top. I think initially it was like the top 4 countries in each region. I can't remember exactly. I have to look back in the paper. And that brought in, for Eastern Europe, it brought in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Czech Republic. But obviously we're missing very important, a lot of very important countries there that could really help to expand and sharpen our analysis here. So I'll just say more work to be done. Leave it at that, and thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Timothy, for the discussion. Very animated.
Thank you all.
And here comes the next paper, which presents a very rich case of press support in Taiwan, one of the 33 countries covered in the paper we just heard. So I invite Hsiao-wen Lee from SOAS, University of London, presenting Good Journalism or Good Business, the Politics of Press Support and News Production in Taiwan.
My presentation is the politics of press support and the news production in Taiwan. This paper aims to explore the relationship in a historical context of Taiwanese news production and press support from 1950s to the present days. There are many different types of press support, directly or indirectly. The most common issues attracting support are the reduction of petrol rents or the repeal of taxes. Both libertarian and authoritarian opinions supported the hypothesis that a press free of taxes would strengthen social systems. Additionally, the great mission behind a free press was to help educate and enlighten ordinary people, enhancing their political knowledge. In Scandinavian countries, where they launched a direct funding system in order to strengthen multi-party pluralism of the press in society, and totalitarian countries use press subsidies for ideological control, and the liberal democracy tradition reduced state intervention to encourage press freedom and the role of the state. But media activists argue that this leads increasingly to the depoliticalization and the deregulation of the news, with content being controlled and dominated by big corporations, causing poor democracy. So there's no neutral media policy, and as any approach will impact the operational practices and the financial sense of the press entities. And this is the background of Taiwanese press industry from 1985 to 1945. Taiwan was under Japanese colonial rule and saw the birth of the modern press industry in Taiwan in 1896 by colonial government. From 1912 onwards saw the start of the period known as the Daisho democracy, where the influence of liberalized democracy impact the Taiwanese press. In 1920s, Taiwanese students in Tokyo set up their own press called Taiwan Youth Weekly. This was the first press strategy by Taiwanese. After World War II, the Allies handed over control of Taiwan to the Republic of China, ROC. Following the ROC government relocated to Taiwan in 1949, the Chiang Kai-shek regime launched the world's longest period of martial law, which Taiwan endured until 1987. During the 38 years of martial law, there was no freedom of speech and very limited license permissions for publications. In 1988, Taiwan entered a time of transformation from totalitarian to liberal democracy. The press restrictions were lifted and the press industry of deregulation. After the strict regulatory control, the period of deregulation also caused many challenges and the competitions for the press industry. In 2000, the first time change ruling party since 1945 from KMT, also known as the Chinese Nationalist Party, to TPP, the Democratic Progressive Party. Also, the first tabloid and the progressive style press started in Taiwan from Hong Kong. Meanwhile, the concerns of commercial and the political influences coming from the third countries intent on causing disruption also be noticed and discussion. So the national press existed in different eras. In Japanese time, Taiwan Youth and Taiwan New People News focused on political campaigning, social movements, and enlightened education, and eventually the first Taiwanese election for local councillor took place in 1935 under the rule of law after their campaigning. However, after World War II, in 1946, KMT authority banned Japanese in all publications in Taiwan. This land excluded many Taiwanese intellectuals since their education had only been under the Japanese system, so they could not write in Chinese. For even worse was to come in 1947. The February 2nd, 28th incident happened. During this incident, there was a massacre in Taiwan when the ruling party killed many Taiwanese intellectuals who challenged or questioned the KMT authorities. After the 228 incident, Taiwanese were almost wiped out from participation in news productions or politics following the chilling effect of the 228 incident. During the era of press restrictions, United Daily News and the China Times were two main private-owned newspapers. The founders were Chinese and China moved to Taiwan along with the KMT authorities. Until the lifting of martial law and press restrictions, United Daily News and China Times have become joint media groups and dominated the press market for a long time. But they also face new competitors such as the Liberty Times, April Daily, and other formats of media outputs. In 2008, China Times Press Group was sold to Wang Wang, the largest cake manufacturer in Taiwan. Wang Wang built a business empire in mainland China and also run Wang Wang China. So the patron-client relationship means that under the KMT authoritarian regime, the private press had maintained a patron-client relationship with the authority. However, the relationship contained contradictions and uncertainties, forcing the private press to seek a balance between the political and the economic logic. Under the martial law, due to the KMT authorities claiming ROC represented mainland China and promoted themselves as Free China, fighting to defeat the People's Republic of China, illegal communist China. KMT were compelled to behave as a democracy window, which needed the private press to cooperate with the government in order to promote a positive image and resolve the legitimate crisis as a member of the international community. So the practices of patron-client relationship were the private press, if their article challenged the authority on matters such as jurisdictions, justice, or democratic reform, the government would the license and cancel the subscriptions from the government departments and ask the press to return lower price of newsprint they receive from the government. By taking away these economic benefits, even by their patron, the private press would find it very hard to operate and would suffer financial problems immediately. Using this way, the private press were compelled to follow the authorities' ideology in exchange for economy survive to keep their business running. So in 1970s, in the international community, the People's Republic of China had gradually been recognized as real China and took over the UN seats previously occupied by the ROC KMT government in Taiwan. And with that, the KMT government had a big role to their legitimacy as representing China in the international community. In domestic affairs, the KMT and their authoritarian government came under challenges from more dissidents, a growing democracy movement, and alternative radical papers other than United Daily News or China Times. Facing these challenges, the KMT authorities, on the one hand, tried to tighten the control of news reporting and opinions, but also needed the two main private press to support the government in defeating the dissidents' voices by publishing more preferential opinions. In order to garner that support, the government gave more benefits to the two private press. After the 1980s, by benefiting from the protections given by the patrol, these two private press had already dominated all of the press industry. They were increasingly emboldened to use their news reporting to interfere in politics or challenge the government policy as well. So the priority of the market-driven journalism is to create or discover what the reader's demands and needs. In this sense, decisions about news products are not only controlled by the newsroom, but also by the marketing departments and the business administration. Due to the protection of their patron, United Daily News and China Times have become joint media groups. After the lifting of the press restrictions, these two presses have extra advantage, allowing them to extend their business directly. For example, China Times Media Group owns subsidiaries comprised of more than 18 different companies that include publishing, marketing, travel agent, grammar school, shopping outlets, entertaining, exhibition, and investment company. And then the United Daily News Media Group also have a wide range of business, such as at least 4 daily publications, numerous monthly magazines, weekly publications, or a data center, internet TV, public opinion, survey company, and a property company as well. And since the government procurement law was launched, project over $100,080 needs to have an open bidding process. These subsidiaries particularly are focused on bidding for these open tender government projects. The United Daily News and the China Times adjust their organizational structure, founding subsidiaries for a new pay news business model, integrating business operations with news. The chief editor in newsroom become the head of the subsidiaries, but benefiting from the government's propaganda budgets or extra business activities. So news page
sorry, your 12 minutes up.
Okay, were particularly reserved just for the pay news. Another extreme example is both in 2018 is the Hualien County. This county used their more than $5 million to promote their government works. But the county divided the whole budget into 25 small tenders and only allowed local journalists to bid for these projects. In this way, this is almost like the local government to bribe in journalists directly. So because during this scandal, so in 2021, there's an amendment to the budget law was officially released, stating that any of the government budget used for promotional news in the media needed to have an advertising indication sign to, and also publish the funding unit's name as well. So then, however, the change priority of press editorial policy had damaged the stature of the fourth estate and its vital role in society's democracy, especially when commercial and political influences can be from the third countries intent on causing disruption. In February 2009, Commonwealth magazine published an expose on the boss of China, stating that he had reported directly to Taiwan Affairs Office after China Times, and that China finance reports also show his company had received subsidies from China's authority every year since 2007 that had facilitated the purchase. And in 2019, Catherine here reported in Times that the boss of China was a staunch pro-Beijing businessman, and that the China Times received direct orders or instructions to follow on a daily basis from China's Taiwan Affairs Office. In 2010, the control yuan in Taiwan had released an investigative report that both China governments spent big money in order to buy Taiwan's newspaper advertising, and the pay news China Times set up an office in Beijing to recruit advertising and promotional business. And this even was a contract that showed China's government contracted with United Daily News and the China Times that including arrangement of how fees would be paid and the money transferred. And
okay, I said, sorry, Hsiao-wen, I would suggest that we stop the presentation here because we have done 15.5 minutes. Let us have a few minutes of discussion before the session ends.
Sorry.
Well, I think it's a very interesting historical paper that gives a lot of background. Of course, Taiwan has gone through actually a change in the media system. In the past, it was more the public subsidy was for propaganda, to use the media as a mouthpiece of the government. But let us come to the present time. You actually put the context of public subsidy in the context of private subsidy given to private media as well. So if we think back to the previous paper, it was reported that the audience share of public media in Taiwan is very low, and the level of public funding to public media in Taiwan is very low. How do you explain this in the context of public subsidy given to private media by private companies?
Yeah, this is this paper tried to point out the serious problem, and because maybe too long the martial law time and the government control the media, so the people or the party, different party compete each other. If any party try to subsidize, give more money to public media, then the opposite party will maybe attack you, try to control the public media, become government media, something like this. But on the other hand, the different government departments, they have a budget to promote their policy or to do their own propaganda, and then the press, the company will go to bid this project. So this is the other indirect way to receive a subsidy from the government. It's not direct, it's indirect. But this is not transparent. This is the main problem. If not transparent, this is very vague. That's why the government budget law point out you need to indicate this is this news from the, or this advertising from the government. Yeah. Sorry, I cannot hear you. Excuse me, I cannot hear you.
Is there a public debate about how public media should be funded, given that the level of funding is quite low?
Yeah, very low. Yeah, very. This is Taiwan is from the highly regulation to non-regulation. So any government budget to the media directly will be fault. This is state intervention. Yeah, this is why they say the previous presenter say the Taiwan very liberal opinion market, because really too liberal, and everyone use their different approach to get funding from everywhere, from commercial private company to government different departments, even to the third countries.
Well, if I'm permitted to diverge a little bit, I noticed in your paper, you actually mentioned the Taiwan autonomous movement. Of course, now we're very aware that the People's Republic of China often accuses Taiwan of Taiwan independence movement. But historically, from what you say, there seems to be this sense of political identity among the Taiwanese themselves, even back to the 19th century. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
The Taiwanese identity in 19th century.
Well, actually, what you said is during the Japanese imperial rule.
Yeah. I think that I want to point out is the press, the people participate the politics and the press development. Also the political environment very important. The international environment very important. And during the Japanese colonial rule, and because the Japanese the modern industry development, so Taiwan also integrate to that development. So people could start campaign and to participate in politics and to set up their own newspapers. But this all stopped after Second World War. But at the time, Taiwanese identity very diverse. Some because of the Japaneseization movement. So some people think they are Japanese, but some pro-China think they are Chinese because they are ancestors from China. This is very diverse.
Right. Well, there are many more questions in the chat, but unfortunately we don't have time to discuss them because we are coming to the end of this session. So 10:45, back to you, Christian.